Well, Tim's done an extremely good job of explaining why we need NAPFOR and or why we need it. And my job now is just to take us through the beginning, how we set this up and the early results, which is what I'm going to deal with now. So the way I'm going to tackle this is just to briefly take you through the aims, what our inclusion criteria were, to go through some of the structure, and then to deal with the census that we performed of airway management activity, and then to look at some of those results, into which will then feed the results of the long-term NAPFOR project. Now, this project was set up quite a long time ago, and the paper that Tim presented from 2007 came out whilst we were in the process of designing NAPFOR. We needed to get information about what was going on with airway management in the UK that wasn't related to litigation. And the sort of information that comes out from critical incidents was not sufficiently detailed to give us what we needed. So we set up a project to look at to investigate the major complications of airway management in UK anaesthetic practice. We wanted to find out how common they were and to calculate the incidence to inform ourselves and the public. But perhaps most importantly, we wanted to look at these individual reports and see what we could learn from them, to see if they would help us with development of our current strategies in the management of airway problems. Now, the sort of problems that we were interested in were the most serious or the major complications of airway management. And those were death, brain damage, the emergency surgical airway. Now, death is fairly straightforward. Brain damage is a little bit more difficult to define, and we left that at the discretion of those supplying the information for us to give us those sort of details at 1 month. And the emergency surgical airway, we defined this as either a needle cricothyroidotomy, a surgical cricothyroidotomy, or a surgical tracheostomy, which was performed as not as the primary procedure. For example, if the patient needed an emergency surgical airway and it was performed under local anaesthetic, then that wouldn't count. If they had another primary airway management plan and there was a rescue emergency surgical airway, that would be taken as a reason for inclusion. Now, when we were looking at the overall project, it became quite clear there was a lot of interest in these sort of data, not just amongst anaesthetists, and the project was set up to look at complications in UK anaesthetic practice, but there was a lot of interest from the Intensive Care Society and from the College of Emergency Medicine. So the project became broadened, and for that reason the inclusion criterion was not just ICU admission, but it was also increased length of stay for those patients who are already on the ICU. The principal reason that we included ICU admission as one of the inclusion criteria was because we thought some of these patients might initially present as an ICU admission, and we needed to get access to those cases to ensure that we picked up all of these. But as it turns out, those patients who were admitted have been a valuable source of information as well. So the object of the exercise was to look at major complications of airway management, and one of our aims was to calculate the incidence. Now, in order to calculate the incidence, we need to know exactly how many complications we have and the number of airway interventions. Now, the object of NAPFOR was to collect case submissions over a 1-year period, and this is the year we chose, September 2008 to 2009. And this would give us the number of complications, and then we needed to divide that by the number of general anaesthetics. And as we've already heard, the number of general anaesthetics was not clearly defined. And so in order to make this calculation, we needed to divide NAP4 into two phases: the data collection phase of the individual case reports, and then to conduct a census, which would give us information on current levels of airway management activity to provide the number of airway interventions. Now, the snapshot or the census took place over a 2-year period. At the beginning of the case submission period, so it was in September 2008, or if we had not received that information, that data, by the end of 2009, it could be repeated there, and this provided the denominator for our calculations. That's the way NAP4 was split up into two phases. The organisation of it was that it was built along the same lines as NAP3. We followed pretty much the same model. It was one that could easily be applied to airway management, and there was a structure for the process. So a multidisciplinary planning group was set up to plan the development of the project, and then a group of local reporters were recruited. Some of those would have been the local reporters that had performed that role for NAP3, but in some cases this role was handed over to anaesthetists with an interest in airway management. Now, the local reporters were absolutely key to this project because they performed the census of current airway management activity, and then on the ground they were able to act as a source of communication to collect data on individual cases and to support local anaesthetists. And to enable submission of data, we used the DAS website with secure online data submission. Once we had that information, we set up a review panel in order to assess the cases to see whether they actually met the inclusion criteria, and then to examine the contents of the reports and to look for themes and learning points. I've said the local reporters were key as they were the point of contact. They enabled us to distribute information, and they returned results, and they coordinated the data collection both for the census or the snapshot and for the year-long case reporting exercise. So, the census. This took place in the first 2-week period of September 2008, which was at the beginning of the year-long data collection period. It lasted for 2 weeks, and we asked for quite a lot of information, but what we really needed to know was the number of general anaesthetics and the airway management techniques that were employed. Now, it's a tribute to the diligence of the local reporters, and to some extent the determination with which Tim pursued them, that we actually had 100% of return of data. We received information from every hospital in the country. Now, some local reporters actually emigrated to get away from him, but we still managed to get data from those hospitals. So it's a fantastic achievement. Now, the sort of information that came back from that 2-week period was the number of general anaesthetics. This is during the 2-week period. The number of supraglottic airway devices used, the number of tracheal tubes, and the number of face mask anaesthetics. We did some work in our own hospitals to find out roughly how that 2-week period corresponded to our own hospital workload, and it was about 1/25. So we used a simple multiplying factor to create these figures for the annual number of general anaesthetics, supraglottic airway devices, tracheal tubes, and face mask anaesthetics. About 25% of cases are done under regional anaesthesia, so the number of anaesthetics are higher than that, but general anaesthetics come in at around 2.9 million. When we left the data collection at the discretion of the local reporter, they could use an electronic system or they could use a paper-based system. But what we did ask them to indicate was the accuracy they thought that could be attributed to the data they sent in, and they graded as either accurate, as a close estimate, an estimate, or a complete guess. And The most important bits of information on the number of general anaesthetics given in a year and the device selection carried quite a high degree of accuracy, where about 90% of them thought that it was either accurate or a close estimate. But for other devices, you'll find that the level of reported accuracy is lower, and so we don't have the same degree of confidence about the frequency and use of these particular devices. However, it would be very useful if we were able to cross-reference the figures that we received from the local reporters. And we looked for HES and the Office of National Statistics data, and you can go to the Hospital Episode Statistics website online, and you can download all the procedures that are done in England and Wales. And we looked at the list of primary procedures, and to the irritation of the review panel, we had a captive group of anaesthetists. We had experience of just about every specialty that there was, and we went through every one of the primary procedures and ascribed a figure of either 100%, 95%, 75%, 50%, 25%, 10%, 5% or 0% of the number of those cases that would be done under a general anaesthetic or a regional under a general anaesthetic, and then we multiplied the figures here by that number. These figures only cover the England and Wales, so we multiplied the figure that we got by 1.2 to come up with a figure for the UK. And somewhat miraculously, it's almost unbelievable, we came up with a figure of 3.1 million, which does lead us to believe that we have a degree of confidence in this figure. So that figure now enables us to know the number of airway interventions. What we next need to know is the number of complications. We've got a number of interventions at 2.9 million, and the next phase of the report will give us the number of complications in which we can put in here in order that we can calculate our incidence. Now, the next phase of the project is going to be dealt with by Tim, who's going to show you how we collected those data and what we did with them.